morning mist hung low over the Montana wilderness when Jack Morrison first laid eyes on the orphaned bear cub. It was October 2018 and Jack, a 42-year-old wildlife rehabilitation specialist, had been called to investigate reports of a distressed animal near Glacier National Park. What he found would change his life forever and ultimately end it. The cub, barely 3 months old, was huddled against its mother's lifeless body. Poachers had killed the adult bear for her gallbladder and paws, leaving behind a scene that made even Jack's weathered heart ache. The tiny cub, a male grizzly with distinctive silver-tipped fur, was severely malnourished and wouldn't survive another night in the wild. Jack had spent 20 years working with wildlife, but something about this particular cub struck him differently. Maybe it was the way the little bear looked at him. Not with fear, but with what seemed like desperate hope. Or perhaps it was the timing. Jack had recently lost his wife Sarah to cancer, and the empty cabin he returned to each night had become unbearable. "You and me both, little guy," Jack whispered as he carefully wrapped the cub in a thermal blanket. "We're both alone now." The drive back to Jack's property took 3 hours through winding mountain roads. Jack owned 40 acres of pristine wilderness, complete with a professional wildlife rehabilitation facility he'd built with Sarah's life insurance money. It was supposed to be their dream, a sanctuary where they could care for injured animals before releasing them back to the wild. Now it would serve a different purpose. Jack named the cub Bruno after his grandfather, who had taught him everything about respecting nature. From day one, Bruno was different from other bears Jack had rehabilitated. While most cubs remained wary and wild, Bruno seemed to genuinely bond with Jack. He would follow Jack around the property like an oversized puppy, making soft huffing sounds when he wanted attention. The first few months were magical. Jack bottle-fed Bruno a special formula designed for bear cubs, mixing it with honey and salmon oil. He taught Bruno to fish in the stream that ran through the property, though the cub was more interested in playing than hunting. At night, Bruno would sleep in a specially built enclosure attached to Jack's cabin, and Jack would often fall asleep to the sound of the cub's gentle snoring. Local wildlife authorities were skeptical when Jack applied for a special permit to keep Bruno long-term. Montana law strictly prohibited keeping wild animals as pets, but Jack argued that Bruno had been too young when orphaned to develop proper survival skills. After extensive documentation and several inspections, Jack was granted a conditional permit with strict requirements. Bruno had to be contained in a proper enclosure, regular veterinary checkups were mandatory, and state wildlife officers would conduct monthly inspections. As Bruno grew, so did their bond. Jack documented everything on his YouTube channel, Mountain Man and Bruno, which quickly gained hundreds of thousands of subscribers. People were fascinated by the unusual relationship between man and bear. Videos of Bruno playing with giant rubber balls, swimming with Jack in the pond, and even appearing to help with chores around the property went viral. Dr. Patricia Hawkins, a renowned animal behaviorist from the University of Montana, visited Jack's property in Bruno's second year. She was initially skeptical, but left impressed. "What Jack has achieved with Bruno is remarkable," she told a documentary crew. "However, we must remember that Bruno is still a wild animal with instincts that could surface at any moment. The relationship is beautiful, but inherently dangerous." Jack always bristled at such warnings. He knew Bruno better than anyone, he insisted. They had developed a communication system of sorts. Different sounds meant different things. A particular grunt meant Bruno was hungry, a soft whine meant he wanted to play, and a specific huffing pattern meant he was happy. Jack could read Bruno's moods from his body language, the position of his ears, the way he moved. By year 3, Bruno had grown into a magnificent specimen, weighing nearly 600 pounds. Despite his size, he remained gentle with Jack, carefully taking treats from his hand, never using his full strength during their play sessions. Jack had built an elaborate system of enclosures covering 5 acres, complete with caves, climbing structures, and a large pond. Bruno had everything a bear could want, except his freedom. The YouTube channel had become Jack's primary source of income. With over 2 million subscribers, sponsors sent special bear treats, toys, and equipment. Fan mail poured in from around the world. children drew pictures of Bruno, and several wildlife organizations invited Jack to speak about his unique experience. He always emphasized that what he was doing was not recommended and only possible because of his extensive experience and special circumstances. But fame brought unwanted attention too. Animal rights activists protested that keeping Bruno was cruel, regardless of the circumstances. They organized online campaigns demanding Bruno be released or transferred to a sanctuary. Jack received death threats from extremists on both sides, those who thought he was exploiting Bruno and those who were angry he wouldn't let tourists visit. The pressure took its toll on Jack. He became increasingly isolated, spending all his time with Bruno. Old friends complained he'd become obsessed, that he talked about nothing but the bear. Jack's brother, Tom, drove up from Denver one weekend and was alarmed by what he saw. "Jack, you've lost perspective," Tom said over dinner, Bruno visible through the window, pacing in his enclosure. "This isn't healthy. You're using that bear to avoid dealing with Sarah's death." Jack exploded in anger. "Bruno needs me. I saved his life. We have a connection you couldn't understand." Tom left the next morning, and they didn't speak for 6 months. The first sign of trouble came in Bruno's 4th year during the spring of 2022. It had been an unusually harsh winter, and food had been scarce. Jack had to drive further to get the fresh salmon Bruno preferred, and the bear had been restless, pacing more than usual. One morning in April, Jack entered Bruno's enclosure as he had thousands of times before. But something was different. Bruno didn't come to greet him with his usual enthusiasm. Instead, the bear stood on his hind legs, all 8 feet of him, and let out a roar that made Jack's blood run cold. It wasn't a playful sound, it was a warning. Jack slowly backed out of the enclosure, his heart pounding. Bruno had never displayed such aggression before. Jack tried to rationalize it. Maybe Bruno was just having an off day, maybe he wasn't feeling well. But deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted. He called Dr. Marcus Webb, the veterinarian who had been treating Bruno since he was a cub. Dr. Webb came out the next day and sedated Bruno for an examination. Everything appeared normal physically, but the vet was concerned. "Jack, Bruno is entering his prime years. His testosterone levels are surging. In the wild, he'd be establishing territory, fighting other males, looking for mates. These instincts don't just disappear because he was raised by humans." Jack nodded, but didn't truly accept the warning. Bruno was different, he told himself. Their bond was stronger than mere instinct, but the incidents continued. Bruno destroyed one of his favorite toys, a massive boomer ball he'd played with for years. In what seemed like a fit of rage, he began refusing certain foods he'd always enjoyed. Most concerning, he started displaying stereotypical behaviors, repetitive pacing patterns that indicated psychological distress in captive animals. Jack increased Bruno's enrichment activities. He built new structures, introduced new scents and toys, and spent even more time with the bear. He convinced himself that Bruno just needed more stimulation, more attention. The YouTube videos during this period showed a noticeably different Bruno, still magnificent, but with an edge of unpredictability that sharp-eyed viewers noticed. Comments started appearing. "Is it just me, or does Bruno seem agitated lately? Jack, please be careful, something seems off. That bear's body language is screaming stress signals." Jack deleted the negative comments and blocked the users. He posted a video addressing the haters, insisting that armchair experts didn't know Bruno like he did, but privately he was worried. He started carrying bear spray when entering the enclosure, something he'd never done before. The summer brought temporary relief. Bruno seemed calmer, spending hours lounging in his pond, catching fish Jack released for him. They resumed their old routines, morning walks around the perimeter of the enclosure, afternoon training sessions where Bruno would demonstrate his intelligence by solving puzzle feeders, evening grooming sessions where Jack would brush Bruno's thick coat. A documentary crew from National Geographic arrived in August to film a special about their relationship. The director, Amanda Chen, was immediately struck by the complexity of what she observed. "There's no doubt there's genuine affection between them," she told her crew, "but there's also an underlying tension. Jack seems almost desperate to prove everything is fine, and Bruno, there's something in his eyes. He's tolerating this, but for how long?" During filming, there was a moment that didn't make it into the final cut. Bruno suddenly charged at the fence when one of the camera operators got too close, hitting it with such force that the entire structure shook. Jack laughed it off, saying Bruno was just being protective, but the crew was shaken. Fall arrived with a series of storms that kept Bruno agitated. Thunder had always bothered him, but now he would roar back at the sky, challenging the noise. After one particularly severe storm, Jack found that Bruno had clawed deep gouges into several trees, marking territory in a way he'd never done before. Dr. Hawkins returned for another visit in October, 4 years after her first assessment. She was alarmed by the changes she observed. Bruno's behavior patterns had shifted dramatically. He was exhibiting signs of what she called behavioral drift, a gradual return to wild instincts despite years of conditioning. "Jack, I'm going to be blunt," she said after her observation. "Bruno is a fully mature male grizzly bear with all the instincts and drives that entails. The remarkable relationship you've built doesn't erase millions of years of evolution. You need to seriously consider transferring him to a sanctuary with less direct human contact." Jack was furious. "You want me to abandon him? Send him to some concrete prison where he'll be just another attraction? Bruno would die without me. We need each other." Dr. Hawkins left with a heavy heart, later noting in her journal, "I fear this will end tragically. Jack Morrison has lost the ability to see Bruno as what he truly is, a wild animal, not a pet, not a friend, not a substitute for human companionship. The bear is not the problem. It's the man's refusal to accept reality." Winter came early that year, with the first heavy snow falling in early November. Bruno's winter coat grew thick and lustrous, and he seemed to settle into a calmer pattern. Jack allowed himself to relax, to believe that the difficult period had passed. The YouTube channel hit 3 million subscribers, and Jack signed a deal for a book about his life with Bruno. He spent the cold evenings writing with Bruno visible through the window, often sleeping in his heated den. Jack wrote about their bond, about how Bruno had saved him from despair after Sarah's death, about the unique understanding they shared. He wrote about trust, about the bridge that could be built between human and animal worlds. He never finished the book. January 2023 brought the coldest temperatures Montana had seen in a decade. The stream on Jack's property froze solid, and snowdrifts reached 6 feet in some places. Bruno spent most of his time in his den, emerging only for meals. Jack had to use a snowblower just to create paths to Bruno's enclosure. It was during this harsh period that Jack made a decision that would prove fatal. The heating system in Bruno's main shelter failed during a blizzard. The repair technician couldn't make it up the mountain for days. Jack, worried about Bruno's comfort, decided to allow the bear into a section of his cabin that had been specially reinforced years earlier for emergency situations. For 3 days and nights, Bruno stayed inside with Jack. They fell into an eerily domestic routine. Bruno would lie by the fireplace while Jack read or worked on his laptop. They ate meals at roughly the same times, Jack at his table, Bruno from his special feeding station. Jack even let Bruno sleep in the reinforced room adjacent to his bedroom, something he'd never done with an adult bear. Those 3 days reinforced Jack's belief that Bruno was different, special, almost human in his understanding. What Jack didn't realize was that he had crossed a crucial boundary. In Bruno's mind, the hierarchy had shifted. The cabin was now shared territory, and in bear society, shared territory must eventually be claimed by the stronger individual. When the heating was repaired and Bruno returned to his enclosure, he was different. He would stand at the fence nearest the cabin and vocalize for hours, demanding to be let back in. When Jack didn't comply, Bruno began showing signs of what could only be described as anger. He destroyed enrichment items, scattered his food instead of eating it, and once charged at Jack when he entered the enclosure, stopping just short of making contact. Jack's brother Tom made another visit in February and was horrified by what he saw. Jack had lost weight, had dark circles under his eyes, and seemed jumpy and paranoid. But most concerning was his absolute refusal to see the danger he was in. "He's just going through a phase," Jack insisted, "like a moody teenager. He'll settle down when spring comes." Tom tried to reason with him. "Jack, that moody teenager weighs 600 pounds and could kill you with one swipe of his paw. This isn't a Disney movie. You need to get help. Maybe bring in another handler, someone who can be objective. The argument that followed was their last conversation. Jack accused Tom of never understanding him, of being jealous of the attention Bruno brought, of wanting him to fail. Tom left in frustration, but not before making a call to Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, expressing his concerns about his brother's safety. The wildlife officers conducted an unscheduled inspection the following week. They found no violations. Bruno's enclosure met all requirements. He appeared healthy, and Jack seemed in control. But Officer Sarah Martinez noted in her report, there is observable tension between the animal and handler. Morrison appears overconfident and dismissed safety concerns. Recommend increased monitoring. March arrived with warming temperatures and Bruno's mood seemed to improve. He began eating normally again and showed interest in enrichment activities. Jack resumed filming for YouTube, though he was selective about what he posted. The playful moments made it online. The aggressive displays did not. One video from this period, titled Bruno's Spring Awakening, showed the bear playing in melting snow, catching fish Jack tossed to him, and even appearing to dance to music Jack played on a speaker. It got 5 million views in a week. Comments poured in about how beautiful their relationship was, how it proved that love could transcend species barriers. But there were other moments the camera didn't capture. The time Bruno grabbed Jack's arm during a feeding and didn't let go for several terrifying seconds, his teeth just barely pressing into the thick jacket. The morning Jack found Bruno had bent the steel bars of one section of fencing, testing for weaknesses. The way Bruno had started looking at Jack, not with affection, but with what seemed like calculation. Dr. Webb visited for Bruno's annual checkup in early April. The bear had to be sedated from outside the enclosure using a dart gun, as he had become too unpredictable to approach safely. The examination showed Bruno was in perfect physical health, but the vet pulled Jack aside afterward. I've been doing this for 30 years, Jack, and I've never been more certain of anything. You need to stop direct contact with Bruno immediately. No more entering his enclosure. Feed him through the barriers. I'm seeing all the signs of a bear that's about to assert dominance, and you won't survive if he does. Jack promised to be more careful, but he couldn't bring himself to stop visiting Bruno directly. The bear was his life, his purpose, his closest companion. To put barriers between them would be admitting failure, admitting that everyone who said it couldn't work had been right. April 15th, 2023 started like any other day. Jack woke at sunrise, prepared Bruno's breakfast, 20 pounds of salmon, sweet potatoes and various fruits, and headed out to the enclosure. Bruno was waiting by the gate, as he always did, but something in his posture was different. He stood taller, his head held higher, his eyes locked on Jack with an intensity that should have been a final warning. Jack hesitated at the gate. Every instinct honed over 20 years of working with wildlife screamed at him to stop, to turn around, to not enter the enclosure, but he pushed the feeling aside. This was Bruno, his Bruno, the cub he'd bottle-fed, the bear he'd raised from infancy, his companion through the darkest period of his life. "Hey buddy," Jack said softly, entering the enclosure with the food bucket. "Hungry this morning?" Bruno didn't respond with his usual chuff of greeting. Instead, he began to circle Jack, a behavior he'd never exhibited before. In the wild, this was how bears assessed threats or prey. Jack's heart rate spiked, but he forced himself to remain calm, to not show fear. "Bruno, sit," Jack commanded, using the hand signal they'd practiced thousands of times. For a moment, Bruno paused and Jack thought everything would be okay. Then, with a speed that seemed impossible for an animal his size, Bruno charged. Jack had maybe 2 seconds to react. He dropped the bucket and reached for the bear spray on his belt, but Bruno was already on him. The first blow came from the side, Bruno's massive paw catching Jack across the ribs, sending him flying 10 feet through the air. Jack heard ribs crack as he hit the ground, pain exploding through his chest. He tried to curl into a ball, to protect his vital organs as he'd been trained to do in a bear attack. But this wasn't a wild bear following instinct to eliminate a threat. This was Bruno, and he knew exactly where Jack was vulnerable. Bruno flipped Jack over with disturbing ease, his claws raking across Jack's back, shredding through his heavy jacket like tissue paper. Jack screamed, the sound echoing across the mountain. He managed to get his hand on the bear spray and discharged it directly into Bruno's face. The bear roared and backed off momentarily, pouring at his eyes. Jack tried to crawl towards the gate, leaving a trail of blood in the dirt. He made it maybe 6 feet before Bruno recovered and was on him again. This time, Bruno bit down on Jack's shoulder, his teeth puncturing through muscle and grinding against bone. Jack felt his consciousness starting to fade from the pain and blood loss. With his free hand, he managed to pull out his phone and hit the emergency button he'd programmed to alert both 911 and his nearest neighbor, Mike Peterson, who lived 2 miles away. Bruno dragged Jack deeper into the enclosure, away from the gate, as if he knew that was Jack's escape route. Then, seemingly satisfied that Jack was no longer a threat, Bruno did something that would haunt everyone who heard about it later. He simply walked away and began eating the salmon from the overturned bucket, occasionally glancing at Jack's motionless form. Mike Peterson arrived first, 15 minutes after receiving the alert. He'd brought his hunting rifle, hoping he wouldn't need it. The scene that greeted him was horrific. Jack was lying in a pool of blood, unconscious but still breathing shallowly. Bruno was 30 feet away, watching Mike with what seemed like casual interest. Mike knew he couldn't enter the enclosure. Instead, he used an emergency pole hook they'd installed for such situations to drag Jack slowly toward the gate. Bruno stood up when Mike started moving Jack, and for a terrifying moment, Mike thought the bear would charge again, but Bruno just watched, as if curious about what would happen next. The paramedics arrived 20 minutes later, followed closely by wildlife officers. Jack was still alive but in critical condition. He'd lost a massive amount of blood, had multiple puncture wounds, broken ribs, and possible internal injuries. As they loaded him into the helicopter for emergency transport to Kalispell Regional Medical Center, Jack briefly regained consciousness. "Don't hurt Bruno," he whispered to Officer Martinez. "It's not his fault. Promise me you won't hurt him." Those were the last words Jack Morrison ever spoke. Jack died en route to the hospital. The official cause of death was exsanguination due to multiple traumatic injuries consistent with a bear attack. He was 46 years old. The news spread quickly, first through local channels, then nationally, and within hours, internationally. YouTube star killed by bear he raised from cub became the headline that dominated news cycles for days. The YouTube channel's subscriber count surged to over 5 million as people rushed to watch the videos of Jack and Bruno looking for signs they'd missed, moments that foreshadowed the tragedy. Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks faced an immediate dilemma: what to do with Bruno. Protocol dictated that any animal that killed a human should be euthanized, but Jack's dying wish, combined with massive public pressure from his followers, complicated the decision. A petition to spare Bruno's life gathered over 1 million signatures in 48 hours. Dr. Patricia Hawkins was brought in to assess Bruno's behavior and make recommendations. She spent 3 days observing the bear, who seemed largely unaffected by recent events. He ate normally, played with his toys, and showed no signs of unusual aggression. "This wasn't a malicious attack," Dr. Hawkins explained at a press conference. Bruno was doing what adult male bears do, asserting dominance over territory and resources. In his mind, Jack had become a subordinate who challenged his authority by entering his space. The tragedy is that Jack either couldn't or wouldn't recognize the signs. The investigation revealed troubling details about Jack's final months. His journal, recovered from the cabin, showed an increasing obsession with Bruno and a growing disconnect from reality. Entries included statements like, "Bruno understands me better than any human ever has," and "Sometimes I think he's more human than bear. Sometimes I think I'm more bear than human." Mike Peterson, Jack's neighbor, told investigators about conversations where Jack had expressed feeling like Bruno was his son and that they had a spiritual connection that transcended species. He'd lost touch with reality, Mike said sadly. Sarah's death broke something in him, and Bruno filled that void. But you can't replace human connection with a wild animal, no matter how much you want to. Tom Morrison, Jack's brother, was devastated but not surprised. "I knew this would happen. We all knew. But Jack wouldn't listen. He'd convinced himself that love was enough, that their bond was special. He forgot that Bruno was a bear, not a person, not a pet, not a friend, just a bear doing what bears do. The YouTube channel was demonetized and eventually taken down at the request of Jack's family, though copies of the videos circulated on other platforms. The footage became a case study in wildlife management programs, a cautionary tale about the dangers of anthropomorphizing wild animals. After much deliberation, wildlife officials decided not to euthanize Bruno. Instead, he was transported to a wildlife sanctuary in Minnesota that specialized in bears that couldn't be released to the wild. The transfer was conducted under heavy sedation, with a team of experts ensuring Bruno's safety. The Wild Paws Sanctuary in northern Minnesota was nothing like Jack's property. Bruno's new enclosure was larger, nearly 10 acres, but there was no direct human contact. Food was delivered through chutes and observation was done from elevated platforms outside the enclosure. It was designed to give Bruno as natural a life as possible while ensuring human safety. For the first few weeks, Bruno seemed to search for Jack. He would approach the areas where handlers stood, vocalizing in ways the staff had never heard from their other bears. Dr. James Whitfield, the sanctuary's director, noted that Bruno displayed signs of what could only be described as confusion. He'd been conditioned for years to expect human interaction, Dr. Whitfield explained. Suddenly, that was gone. It's not grief as we understand it, but there was definitely an adjustment period. He was looking for the patterns and routines he'd known his entire life. Gradually, Bruno adapted. He began to interact with the other bears in adjacent enclosures, the first unseen contact he'd had since infancy. He learned to forage for hidden food, to build day beds, to behave more like a wild bear than he ever had with Jack. The sanctuary staff noted that many of his stereotypical behaviors, the repetitive pacing, the agitation, decreased significantly once human interaction was removed. 6 months after the attack, a documentary crew was allowed to film Bruno for a special about the incident. The bear they captured on camera was magnificent but wholly wild. Gone were any traces of the performative behaviors he'd exhibited for Jack's camera. He was simply a bear being a bear. Dr. Hawkins, who consulted on the documentary, provided crucial context. What happened to Jack Morrison was a tragedy, but it was a preventable one. The warning signs were there for years. Bruno's increasing aggression, his testing of boundaries, his assertion of dominance. These are natural behaviors for a mature male bear. Jack's love for Bruno blinded him to the reality that love alone cannot overcome millions of years of evolution. The documentary included interviews with other people who had attempted to keep bears as pets or pseudo-pets. Most had similar stories of initial success followed by increasingly dangerous behavior as the bears matured. The few who hadn't experienced attacks had all made the difficult decision to cease direct contact with their bears before tragedy struck. The difference between Jack and those of us who survived, said Marcus Bell, who had raised an orphaned black bear before transferring it to a sanctuary, is that we recognized when our bears stopped seeing us as caregivers and started seeing us as either rivals or prey. Jack couldn't make that distinction. He was too emotionally invested. The Morrison family struggled with the aftermath. Tom Morrison became an advocate for stricter regulations on keeping wild animals, even with permits. "My brother died because the system failed him," Tom said in testimony before the Montana legislature. "He should never have been allowed to keep Bruno once the bear showed signs of aggression. We need mandatory transfer protocols, not suggestions." Jack's cabin and property were sold, with the proceeds going to a wildlife conservation fund in Sarah and Jack's names. The new owners demolished the bear enclosure and returned the land to its natural state. Within a year, wild bears were occasionally spotted passing through the property, reclaiming what had always been their territory. The incident sparked renewed debate about wildlife content on social media. Critics argued that channels like Jack's encouraged people to seek dangerous interactions with wild animals for views and fame. Supporters countered that Jack's videos had educated millions about bears and fostered appreciation for wildlife. YouTube implemented new policies about animal content, requiring disclaimers about dangerous activities and prohibiting monetization of videos showing direct contact with certain species, including large predators. The changes were informally known as Jack's Law among content creators. As the first anniversary of Jack's death approached, Dr. Patricia Hawkins published a comprehensive study on human-bear bonding and its limitations. Her research, which included extensive analysis of Jack and Bruno's relationship, challenged many assumptions about interspecies connections. What Jack experienced with Bruno was real emotional bonding, she wrote. The oxytocin response, the behavioral synchronization, the apparent mutual affection, these were all genuine. But they existed within a framework that Jack fundamentally misunderstood. He interpreted Bruno's behaviors through a human lens, seeing love where there was merely conditioning, understanding where there was simply routine. The study revealed that Bruno's brain scans, taken during his medical examinations, showed normal bear neural patterns. There was no evidence of the enhanced emotional processing that would suggest human-like bonding capabilities. Bruno had been a bear acting like a bear, even when those actions seemed to indicate otherwise. Former colleagues of Jack's came forward with stories that painted a complex picture of a man struggling with grief and isolation. Dr. Webb, the veterinarian, revealed that Jack had been prescribed antidepressants after Sarah's death but had stopped taking them, saying Bruno was all the therapy he needed. Jack was a brilliant wildlife handler, Doctor, Webb said, but after Sarah died, he became someone else. Bruno became his entire world, his reason for living. He couldn't see the danger because acknowledging it would mean admitting he was alone again. The book Jack had been writing was posthumously completed by a ghostwriter using his notes and journals. Titled Living with Bruno, a Love Story, it became a bestseller despite, or perhaps because of, its tragic ending. Readers were divided between those who saw it as a beautiful testament to the power of interspecies connection and those who read it as a cautionary telltale about the dangers of anthropomorphism. Critical reviews pointed out the gradual shift in Jack's writing. Early entries were observational and scientific, noting Bruno's behaviors objectively. But as years passed, the language became increasingly emotional and anthropomorphized. Bruno went from displaying food-seeking behavior to asking for his favorite treats, from vocalizing to talking to me, from the bear to my boy. Wildlife educators began using Jack's story as a teaching tool. Professor Michael Roberts at the University of Montana developed an entire course around the incident, examining the psychological, biological, and ethical dimensions of human-wildlife interactions. Students come in thinking this is a simple story about a man who made a fatal mistake, Professor Roberts explained. But as we dig deeper, they realize it's about grief, isolation, the human need for connection, and the dangerous tendency to project our emotions onto animals. Jack wasn't stupid or careless, he was human, and that humanity ultimately killed him. The 1-year anniversary of Jack's death was marked by a small memorial service in Montana. Tom Morrison spoke about his brother, remembering not the man who died in a bear enclosure, but the boy who had loved animals, the young man who had dedicated his life to wildlife conservation, the husband who had adored his wife. Jack lost his way, Tom said, his voice breaking. But that doesn't erase the good he did, the animals he saved, the people he inspired to care about wildlife. I just wish he could have saved himself. Meanwhile, at the Wild Paws Sanctuary, Bruno continued his new life. He had adapted fully to his environment, showing no signs of missing human interaction. He foraged, swam, climbed, and did all the things bears do. Staff members who didn't know his history wouldn't have guessed he'd been raised by humans. On the anniversary of Jack's death, Dr. Whitfield stood on the observation platform, watching Bruno fish in his pond. A visitor asked if Bruno remembered Jack, if he ever showed signs of mourning or missing his former life. Bears don't think like we do, Doctor, Whitfield replied. Bruno lives in the present. He doesn't reminisce about the past or worry about the future. In a way, he's freed from the burden of memory that we carry. Jack is gone from Bruno's world as completely as if he never existed. That might seem sad to us, but for Bruno it's simply reality. 5 years after Jack Morrison's death, the story of the man and the bear he raised had become a modern fable, interpreted differently depending on who told it. For some, it was a story of love transcending species barriers. For others, it was a cautionary tale about the dangers of forgetting that wild animals are not pets. Bruno, now 11 years old, had become one of the elder statesmen of the Wild Paws Sanctuary. He had mellowed with age, spending most of his time lounging in the sun or slowly foraging through his territory. New staff members were always told his story as part of their training, a reminder of why the sanctuary maintained such strict no-contact protocols. In 2028, a young wildlife biologist named Sarah Chen, no relation to the documentary director, arrived at the sanctuary to study bear behavior. She was particularly interested in bears that had been raised in captivity and how they compared to wild bears. Bruno became one of her primary subjects. Through months of observation, Sarah noted that Bruno displayed some unique behaviors that set him apart from both wild bears and other captive-raised bears. He showed an unusual awareness of human presence, often positioning himself where he could observe staff members even when they weren't directly interacting with him. He responded to certain sounds, particularly machinery noises similar to those Jack would have used, with heightened attention. It's not that he remembers Jack specifically, Sarah explained in her thesis, but the neural pathways formed during those crucial early years persist. He's imprinted with human awareness in a way that can't be undone. He'll never be fully wild, but he's also no longer domestic. He exists in a liminal space between worlds. Tom Morrison, now in his 50s, had become a prominent advocate for wildlife protection and proper animal handling. He regularly spoke at conferences and schools, sharing Jack's story not to sensationalize it, but to educate people about the complex realities of human-wildlife interaction. My brother loved Bruno, and in whatever way a bear can reciprocate, Bruno may have felt something for Jack too, Tom would say. But love wasn't enough to overcome nature. It never is. The best way to love wild animals is to respect them for what they are, not what we wish they could be. The site of Jack's property had been purchased by a conservation group and turned into the Morrison Wildlife Education Centre. Where Bruno's enclosure once stood, there was now a memorial plaque that read, "In memory of Jack Morrison, who loved not wisely but too well, and Bruno, who was only being a bear." School groups would visit to learn about wildlife conservation, proper animal rehabilitation, and the importance of maintaining boundaries between human and wild spaces. The centre's main building housed a small museum featuring artifacts from Jack's life, his journals, some of Bruno's old toys, photos from happier times. The final exhibit was a video screen showing a loop of carefully selected clips from Jack's YouTube channel. There was Bruno as a tiny cub, taking his first wobbly steps. Bruno and Jack swimming together in the pond. Bruno solving a complex puzzle feeder while Jack cheered him on. The footage ended not with the later tenser videos, but with a clip from Bruno's second birthday, when Jack had made him a cake of salmon and berries. Both man and bear looked genuinely happy, unaware of how their story would end. Visitors often stood at this exhibit the longest, some crying, others shaking their heads, most simply contemplating the complex tragedy of two souls who found each other at the wrong time, in the wrong way, with love that was real but ultimately insufficient against the immutable laws of nature. Dr. Hawkins, now retired, would occasionally visit both the education centre and Bruno at the sanctuary. She had written the definitive book on the incident, When Love Is Not Enough, the Jack Morrison tragedy and the limits of human-animal bonds. It won several awards and became required reading in many wildlife management programs. In her conclusion, she wrote, "Jack Morrison died believing that love could conquer nature, that the bond he shared with Bruno transcended the boundaries between species. Perhaps in those final moments he understood the truth, that Bruno had never been his friend, his son, or his companion. Bruno had always been a bear, magnificent and powerful, living according to instincts older than human civilization. The tragedy wasn't that Bruno attacked Jack, it was that Jack had created a situation where such an attack became inevitable." The book's epilogue included a haunting detail from the autopsy report that hadn't been widely publicized. Jack had defensive wounds on his hands and arms, but they were minimal, far less than would be expected from someone fighting for their life. The medical examiner concluded that even in those final moments, Jack had been reluctant to truly fight back against Bruno, perhaps still believing, even as the bear's teeth sank into his flesh, that their bond would prevail. As 2029 dawned, the story of Jack and Bruno had evolved from tragedy to teaching tool. Universities incorporated the case into curricula spanning psychology, biology, ethics, and even philosophy. The question, what went wrong with Jack and Bruno, had no single answer, which made it perfect for academic discussion. Some scholars focused on the phenomenon of pathological anthropomorphism, the dangerous attribution of human characteristics to animals taken to an extreme. They argued that Jack had constructed an elaborate fantasy where Bruno was capable of human-like emotional reasoning, and this delusion ultimately cost him his life. Others examined it through the lens of grief psychology. Dr. Marina Volkov, a specialist in complicated grief, published a paper arguing that Jack had never properly processed Sarah's death. Bruno became a living memorial to his wife, she wrote. Every moment with the bear was a denial of his loss. To give up Bruno would have meant finally accepting that Sarah was gone. Animal behaviorists studied the thousands of hours of footage Jack had recorded, creating a detailed timeline of Bruno's behavioral changes. They identified dozens of warning signs that Jack had either missed or ignored, increasing food aggression, territorial marking, dominance displays, and stress indicators. What's remarkable, noted Dr. James Friedman, who led the study, is how clearly the footage shows Bruno's transformation from a habituated cub to a conflicted adult bear. You can literally watch him struggling between his conditioning and his instincts. Jack interpreted this struggle as Bruno being moody or going through phases, but it was actually a bear slowly reverting to its nature. The footage became valuable for training wildlife rehabilitators, showing them exactly what signs to watch for and when human-wildlife relationships become dangerous. Several rehabilitation centers reported that Jack's story had prompted them to revise their protocols, implementing stricter guidelines about contact with animals as they matured. At the Wild Paws Sanctuary, Bruno had become something of a celebrity, though one kept at a careful distance. Visitors could observe him from viewing platforms, and many came specifically to see the bear from the famous YouTube videos. Some expected to see a monster, others a victim. What they found was simply a bear, magnificent, powerful, and utterly indifferent to their presence. One visitor, a woman named Claire Matthews, had been one of Jack's biggest supporters online. She had watched every video, sent fan mail, and even donated to help with Bruno's care. Seeing Bruno in person 5 years after Jack's death, she was struck by how ordinary he seemed. In the videos, he seemed almost magical, she reflected. This bear that could understand human emotions, that could love and be loved. But watching him now, he's just a bear. A beautiful bear, but just a bear. I think maybe we all wanted to believe in the fairy tale as much as Jack did. The sanctuary received letters regularly, some addressed to Bruno himself. Children sent drawings, adults sent poems, and occasionally someone would send anger, blaming Bruno for killing Jack, calling him a monster, demanding he be put down. These letters were filed away, part of the strange cultural artifact that the story had become. Dr. Whitfield, the sanctuary director, had developed a standard response to questions about Bruno's culpability. You can't blame a bear for being a bear, any more than you can blame water for being wet. Bruno didn't murder Jack Morrison. He simply acted according to his nature. The responsibility lay with the humans who allowed the situation to develop and continue, despite clear warnings. In the spring of 2029, Tom Morrison made one last pilgrimage to Montana. He visited the education center that bore his brother's name, walked the trails where Jack and Bruno had once wandered, and stood at the spot where his brother had died. The enclosure was gone, returned to wilderness, but Tom could still see it in his mind's eye. He had brought with him a box of things he'd been unable to part with until now. Photos of Jack and Sarah from happier times, Jack's wedding ring which had been recovered after the attack, and a stuffed bear toy that Jack had kept from childhood, the first sign of his lifelong fascination with bears. Tom buried the box beneath a tall pine tree, saying a prayer for his brother's soul and for Bruno, wherever his bear soul might be. He understood now that Jack's death had been written in the stars from the moment he brought that orphaned cub home. Every day after that had been borrowed time, a beautiful but unsustainable defiance of natural law. As he walked back to his car, Tom encountered a black bear on the trail. The bear looked at him with dark, intelligent eyes, assessed him as no threat, and ambled off into the forest. Tom stood frozen, his heart pounding. understanding in that moment both his brother's fascination and his fatal mistake. The bear was magnificent, worthy of awe and respect, but it was not and could never be a friend. Back at the sanctuary, Bruno spent his days in peace. At 15 years old, he was entering the prime of his life for a captive bear. He had claimed every inch of his territory, worn smooth paths along his favorite routes, and established routines that satisfied his instincts. He no longer looked for humans at the fences, no longer responded to human voices with anything more than mild curiosity. Sometimes the staff would play old YouTube videos of Jack and Bruno in the break room, marveling at how different Bruno had seemed then, almost like a different bear entirely. The young Bruno who had played with toys and cuddled with Jack was unrecognizable in the mature bear who now ruled his domain with quiet authority. "Do you think he ever thinks about Jack?" a new intern asked Dr. Whitfield one day. "Bears don't think the way we do, Doctor," Whitfield replied, giving his standard answer. But then he paused, looking out at Bruno lounging in the afternoon sun. But sometimes, very rarely, he'll do something, a particular head tilt, a specific vocalization, that he only ever did with Jack. Make of that what you will. The truth was, nobody really knew what went on in Bruno's mind. Did he remember the man who had raised him? Did he ever wonder why the familiar voice and scent had suddenly vanished from his world? Or had Jack simply been erased from his memory, overwritten by the more pressing concerns of territory, food, and seasonal changes? The answer would never be known, and perhaps that was fitting. The gulf between human and animal consciousness that Jack had tried so desperately to bridge remained as wide as ever. His death had proven not that the bridge couldn't be built, but that crossing it came with a price that eventually must be paid. Conclusion: the bear that broke trust. In the end, the story of Jack Morrison and Bruno the bear became different things to different people. To wildlife professionals, it was a cautionary tale about the dangers of anthropomorphism and the importance of maintaining professional boundaries. To the public, it was a tragic love story between species. To psychologists, it was a case study in grief, isolation, and the human need for connection. To Tom Morrison, it was simply the story of how he lost his brother twice. First to grief, then to the bear that grief led him to. But perhaps the most honest interpretation came from a child who visited the education center, looked at the photos of Jack and Bruno and said to her mother, "The man loved the bear, but the bear was just being a bear." In those simple words lay the entire truth. Jack Morrison had loved Bruno with all the desperate intensity of a grieving heart seeking solace. He had poured into that relationship all the love he could no longer give to his deceased wife, all the paternal instincts that would never be fulfilled, all the need for companionship that his isolation had intensified. Bruno, for his part, had simply lived his life as a bear, accepting food, shelter, and attention when it benefited him, following his instincts as they developed, and ultimately acting according to his nature when those instincts could no longer be suppressed. There was no malice in what he did, no betrayal, no breaking of trust. There was only a bear being a bear, doing what bears do when their territory is entered by something they no longer recognize as dominant. The trust that was broken was never Bruno's to break. It was Jack's trust in his own ability to transcend nature through love, his belief that connection could overcome instinct, his faith that Bruno was something more than what he was. Jack had trusted in an impossible dream, and that trust had killed him as surely as Bruno's teeth and claws. 5 years after the attack, Bruno continued to live his life at the Wild Paws Sanctuary, unaware that he had become a symbol, a cautionary tale, a viral sensation, and a killer. He was simply a bear living in captivity, as comfortable as such a life could make him, following the rhythms of seasons and instincts that preceded human civilization by millennia. And perhaps that was the most important lesson of all, that nature, in its beautiful and terrible indifference, does not bend to human will, no matter how strong our love, how deep our connection, or how desperately we wish it would. The bear that broke trust had never given his trust to begin with. That was simply a story humans told themselves, right up until the moment reality reasserted itself with fatal consequences. Jack Morrison died believing in a beautiful lie. Bruno lived on in the simple truth of his nature. And somewhere between those two realities lay the lesson that would hopefully prevent others from following Jack's path. That wild animals, no matter how we raise them, no matter how we love them, no matter how they seem to love us back, remain wild. To forget that truth is to invite tragedy. The last entry in Jack's journal, written the night before his death, read, "Bruno seemed distant today, but tomorrow will be better. Tomorrow we'll reconnect. Tomorrow he'll remember who we are to each other. Tomorrow." There was no tomorrow for Jack Morrison, but Bruno's tomorrows stretched on, each one the same as the last, uncomplicated by human emotion, unmarked by grief or regret, simple in the way that only an animal's life can be. He had killed the only human who ever loved him, and he neither knew nor cared. He was a bear. He had always been a bear, and in the end, that was the only truth that mattered. The story of the bear that broke trust was never really about trust at all. It was about the dangerous power of human projection, the fatal consequences of loneliness, and the immutable laws of nature that no amount of love can change. Jack Morrison learned that lesson too late. His story ensures others might learn it in time. Bruno still lives at the Wild Paws Sanctuary. Older now, his muzzle graying, his movements slower. Visitors still come to see him, though fewer each year as the story fades from memory. He will live out his days in comfort and safety, never again to interact directly with humans, never again to be anything more or less than what he is, a bear, magnificent and terrible, innocent and deadly, forever wild despite the walls that contain him. And perhaps that is the most fitting end to this story, not with drama or revelation, but with the simple continuation of a bear's life, unmarked by human meaning, proceeding according to rhythms older than memory, as if Jack Morrison had never existed at all. In the end, nature always wins. It just sometimes takes a while to collect.